Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. This is not going to be a long introduction today. I'm very excited about the show that we're about ready to jump into. Today, we are gathering together with Peter Blau, Ray Betzner, and Jim Hawkins to discuss the enduring legacy and important status of one of the legendary personalities in our collective Sherlockian history, John Bennett Shaw. You know, one of the goals of this show has been to introduce people to people, events, publications that perhaps they have either forgotten about or, being a newer Sherlockian, never had the opportunity to really learn about or understand. But Shaw is one of these characters in our history that everybody should have an awareness of. So welcome, gentlemen. I'm very happy to have you all here today. This is quite exciting, and I am very grateful that you're here to talk about our friend and acquaintance, John Bennett Shaw. Peter and Ray, you have both been here before, but Jim, you are a newcomer to the show. And so, well, I'm happy to have you here. So this is amazing. So, as we heard in the introduction, Jim, you are the curator of the Friends of the John Bennett Shaw website and Facebook page. They're associated, and you have been collecting photographs and stories and artifacts to sort of help keep John Bennett Shaw's memory alive. Right. And good work. And Jim, did you know John yourself?
Yes, I met him when I became a consultant for the Baptist Convention, and we had a summer camp in Glorieta, which is just outside Santa Fe. We had been in touch with John through the email and mails, mostly mail, because he didn't have email, right? And I asked him if I could come visit him because I was going to be there. It was 1986. So that's the first time I ever met Shaw. I was at his workshop that Ray headed up in 87, but we might get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that for sure. Yeah. Now, Peter, I know you knew John. How far back did your acquaintanceship with John go?
More than 50 years. Wow. I was working as a petroleum geologist, wound up in Tulsa, which is where John lived at the time, and figured it was time I went to visit him. And it was wonderful, because he took me upstairs and into his library, which is a huge room, completely lined with books twice. Every bookshelf had books behind books, because at that time, he was collecting not just Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle, but also G.K. Chesterton and Isaac Dinesen and other things. John was just a compulsive collector. And it was astounding. It's the first time I'd ever been in a personal library like that. And I just had a wonderful time doing what I still do in people's libraries, which is wander around, looking at the shelves, looking for things I'd never seen before. And I'd say, wow, and John would tell me a story about it. And finally I got to a point in one bookshelf, and I pulled out a book by Henry Lauritsen, my dear Watson. And in it, there were these little caricatures of Sherlockian characters. And they'd been published, some of them in the Baker Street Journal. And I had asked Henry Lauritsen to do Black Peter for me, and he did. That's the Black Peter caricature that appears on my business card. But anyway, I said, oh my God, my dear Watson, I knew about the book. I'd never seen it. And John, sitting at his desk, says, don't I have 2 copies? And I said, yes. And I pulled them out. And he said, which is the better one? And I said, this one. And he said, put that back and you can have the other one.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's grand.
That is so
That is grand.
great. Oh, that's so good.
Everything I learned about collecting Sherlockian, I learned from John Bennett Shaw. But that's one of the great lessons, and that's sharing. And John was never a hoarder. I mean, you have duplicate, you should do something with it.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of the memory of John, that's why I had Denny Dover come to the house a few months ago and loaded his car full of my duplicates, and they're up in Reading, Pennsylvania now. And if you go to his open house later this year, you'll probably find some of them.
Well, Ray, so I know you knew John, you met John, and I'm interested in everybody's point of entry, I think, into this story,
Yeah.
because I have my own, but tell us a little bit about where you kind of enter this story.
Sure. I was a journalism student at West Virginia University and a budding Sherlockian, and I came to recognize that there was a Sherlock Holmes Society in Morgantown, West Virginia, and it was led by then prosecuting attorney Andrew G. Fusco. So I convinced the editor of the student newspaper to let me go down and interview Andy about this bizarre group. I called him up. He said he could give me 20 minutes. 2 hours later, I left with two things. One was an invitation to the Scion of the Four next dinner, and the second was the address of John Bennett Shaw, and that started it all.
What year was this? When was this?
This had to have been 1975 or so. I'll go back and try to find the clipping, which I have kept, but it's in a box. And that started it. John had a huge correspondence. I've said elsewhere that before the internet, John was the Sherlockian internet. I mean, he was the connective tissue for so many of us. He does a lot of what Peter, frankly, does now, which is if you write to Peter and say, "Hi, I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan, and I'm living in X," Peter will write back and say, "Oh, there are two societies within driving distance of you, and there's somebody who lives on the other side of town whose address you should know, and write to them, and you will find your fellowship." And so that's exactly the way it worked for John. He had correspondence scattered all around the globe, and he wanted each of us to be on the lookout for him, for unusual and odd Sherlockiana that he might not come across. And that was one of the ways in which he accumulated so much stuff in the period of time that he did. I always said that John had all the discretion of a hurricane. He just sucked everything up in his path. If it had anything to do with all with Sherlock Holmes, he wanted it.
That's true, because I remember I was interviewing him for the original incarnation of Sherlock Holmes Review, and I don't know, back in the early 90s, and I remember him referring to that, his collecting habit, as all the selectivity of a Hoover vacuum cleaner. And so it's sucking up every, had a deer stalker on it, he wanted it, and which I think
every
is
time
great.
I ever saw John, he had a plastic bag or a little portfolio under his arm that he would start on one side of the room and it would be half full, and by the time he made it to the other side of the room, it would be bulging because people kept handing him more and more things. It was just, and he loved it. He just absolutely loved it. He just was so excited by that. But just to get to the story just a wee bit more, I went to my first Shaw conference at Duquesne. Peter, I can't remember. Were you at Duquesne? In Pittsburgh? No. It was wonderful. I never really had met a group of Sherlockians before, and it was really terrific. And for some reason, John invited me up to his room where he and Dorothy were staying, and I just sat there in kind of awe with about a dozen other people around me. I remember Evie was there, and Evie Herzog, and she was either needle pointing or knitting something. I can't remember what it was. in the corner of the room. And, people ran in and out. And John, John, how are you? Was your half of the conversation. And that was it. He just was on a tear. And all evening long. And I realized I've kind of found my family. This is it. This is where I needed to be. And nothing has ever changed my mind in the intervening years.
Well, yeah, I think that he, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about him, because I think for many of us, at least in our, of a certain vintage Sherlockian, Shaw was extremely significant in personally and in helping to build the sort of foundation of the Sherlockian universe that we enjoy so much, and that and we live in largely. For me personally, my first and this is probably a good segue into talking about one of the things we know that he's known as a collector, and we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But and it could be that he is remembered largely by people as a collector now because of the Minnesota Library's collection and that sort of thing. But for me, the first exposure was his first conference, first Sherlockian conference in 1977 at the University of Notre Dame. That's where I was, what's the date for that? It was August 4, 1977.
End of July and the first week of August.
Yeah, this is the, right here is the first, is the registration flyer, which I think is remarkable. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I was 16 years old. I had been a Sherlockian since I was 14, so I was a 2 years and going strong. And I remember opening the newspaper and seeing this article about this event that was going to be out on campus. I lived in South Bend, and I was going to be out on campus, and wow, that sounded amazing. And so now who in this Zoom room was there? I know Ray, you were there, Ray? No,
I was
Peter,
not.
were you there?
No, Duquesne was my first in.
So I was the only one. Okay, so
yeah.
Well, let me tell you, we get there. I was 16, and I joined the local science society there in South Bend, the Solitary Cyclists. I think I was their youngest member, and they were all very generous to bring in this kid. And but this thing was happening there, and so it was summertime, and so I registered, and I gotta be honest. I mean, I look back on it with a mix of as a memory, with a mix of fondness and sort of a memory of a terror as well, because there's all these grown-ups, right? All these adults are there. I think there was one other teenage girl, which I think might have been Ann Byerly. I'm not sure.
Probably. Yeah, Ann was at Notre Dame. Yeah.
Yeah, and but I didn't know anybody. Not that people were, unwelcoming in any way. They were, but I was completely intimidated. Just kind of sat in the back row and felt and probably was largely invisible, which is proven by the fact that I'm in none of the photographs that were taken that day that have survived. But I was there, and this thing was 5 days.
Yeah.
Can you imagine such a thing nowadays? I mean, we marveled at the BSI weekend as 5 days, but this was 5 days, and I think I was there every day. But to cut to the John, well, of course, it was his conference, right? And I think I think it was his first conference. And
It was.
yeah, and I remember sitting there. He must have noticed this nerd in the back row who was having absolutely zero interaction with anybody. And during a break, he came up and started talking to me. And that was, personally speaking, an enormously pivotal moment, and one of a number in my personal Sherlockian life, because I remember that he was not, he was not, I mean, he's John Bennett Shaw, right? He was not talking down to me or talking past me, or just, he was literally, he genuinely was talking with me, sort of Sherlockian peer-to-peer. And even then I recognized that. And if it had been any other way, that might have made a difference in whether I went on or not, And so I just remember him standing there. He seemed very tall to me with that white hair. And I remember thinking, I do remember thinking, oh no, he's coming over here. What am I going to do? But he was great, really great.
Almost as wide as he was tall, too.
Yes, yeah. That's true. But anyway, so that was the first conference, and it was quite an amazing event. But it was the first of, I don't know, Jim, do you know how many conferences that John sponsored over?
It's in the 20s, I think, maybe 25, somewhere in that neighborhood.
25. That's amazing.
That's his conferences, not other things that he was asked to go to and headline. Those were the John Shaw worship workshops.
It was practically worship, yeah.
It was worship,
yeah.
Now, do we know if there had been any other event like this prior to his workshops?
Well, as it happens, I can tell you why John decided to have his workshop in 1977. And that was because Ron DeWall in 1975 arranged a Sherlock Lives conference at Fort Collins University, Colorado State University, Fort Collins. And I invited John Bennett Shaw and Sam Rosenberg and Bob Fish and me to this conference. And John had so much fun at that conference in 1975 that he decided to do his own. And it took him 2 years to find a locale and get ready for it. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
So he didn't actually invent the conference, the Sherlockian conference, but he certainly helped popularize it, I think. I mean, I think once his things got going, it was like my impression was like, oh, the road show is coming to town. That's what it was. It always felt like when you would hear about one of these conferences going on.
He created the formula for them that still pretty much exists today. If you go to Ohio or down to Baltimore, I mean, there are elements that you will recognize from John Shaw's conference. I mean, the huckster's room and the dastardly quizzes and those kinds of things. I mean, John put the formula together, I think, and it was extraordinarily successll. He tried to do two a year, if I remember correctly. One on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one in the central part of the country, if he could.
One of the things that John discovered is that it's very important to have a Sherlockian conference that's not just for Sherlockians. I mean, he really insisted that the local society that was sponsoring this reach out. And John's formula was that at least half the people at the conference ought to be not Sherlockians. He wanted to spread the word, to include everyone. And every once in a while, a society would just announce they're going to do a John Bennett Shaw conference and figure with people who come from thousands of miles to attend a John Bennett Shaw conference. But Sherlockians have been to a lot of John Bennett show, and you wanted to get the people. So he then started doing it only at universities, where the university had a publicity department that would reach out to normal human beings. And it was first lecture at every workshop was to explain to the people who weren't Sherlockians this strange language,
Yeah.
that the canon and things like that. Making sure that people who didn't know our jargon and argot, making sure these people didn't feel excluded or bewildered or outraged.
Talking about exclusion, many of the followers of John, like the adventuresses, they came to his meetings because they wanted to get in on the deal, and they struck out as you and John tried to help them out in New York in 1968. So I see a lot of women coming to these conferences in those days.
Right. And, we take for granted that, the BSI is co-ed these days, but in fact, this was one of those places where men and women could get together and enjoy Sherlock Holmes. And while that wasn't unique, the fact that John, who was such a big figure in the BSI, was kind of leading it was a way of kind of giving a BSI imprimatur to an event that was co-ed.
Right. And Dorothy Shaw was a presenter at several of these, and so was Evie Herzog.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Evie was at the Notre Dame one. I recognize. At the time I didn't know anybody, but I've recognized her in the photographs since then. So I think you're right, Ray. I think and Jim, they were very inclusive, and just again from my own personal experience, I know John, he made a point of talking to everybody. I did notice that, and people would, there was always kind of a circle of people around him yucking it up, during the breaks. I remember that, which I think he loved. I have a letter here, I have a number. Let's talk about, because all this stuff is sort of linked together. He was a huge supporter of people who are doing things in the Sherlockian universe, and correspondent and conference sponsor. And it really is important to remember that at this time, late 70s to, the early, late 80s, early 90s, whenever he stopped doing this, that was we didn't have the internet. This was sort of it, this was a way to sort of spread the word and grow the community. And it's so important. But I have a letter here, one of his, recognize the
letterhead.
The letterhead here, and it's so typical of just everything that we all love about him. The first paragraph begins, "Dear Steve, I've waited to write to congratulate you on your fine work with Sherlock Holmes Review. Really fine, and well designed and worthwhile contributions. You have done a great service." And that was so that, anybody who got a letter like that from him, and many people did. It was a big deal. But he said, "I'd hope to do something for your publication, but I have been terribly busy traveling and talking and buried in letters." Now, this is what's the really important part. "Last Saturday, I counted, and I was 72 behind. Now I have done 25 or so. Also, I have a sudden illness that hurts like the devil and is crippling, carpal tunnel syndrome, nerve in both arms and hands, and the loss of some use of both hands. I'm in treatment and will continue my seminar journeys. Next week, Williamsburg, and this will be the largest event I have ever done. Over 200. Then 2 weeks or so later, on to Stanford." I find that's an interesting piece of information in the history.
He was too ill to make the Stanford. He went in 81, he was there, but 87 he had to turn it over to some other people because he was just worn out. Ray wore him out in Williams.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I like the conclusion too. He says, I send along the Stanford flyer. I also send the program from our B3M trap shoot, a fine event attended by, we'll talk about that in a minute, attended by 52, including folks from five states, and even a fellow from someplace called Texas. He spoke reasonably in English, however. So anyway, that's a little artifact of mine. And but there's so many things, there's so many little pieces of information in there. So think about the correspondence for a minute. You know, Ray, you touched
Yeah.
upon that earlier, but
Yeah, yeah.
I can't keep up on correspondence at all. I can't imagine having to do this by hand on a typewriter.
Yeah,
75 to manually type out 25 letters a day. Letters, not just an email, you know, this is like letters. And just the devotion and the energy that took.
Oh yeah,
remarkable.
yeah, Steve. You know, so after a while, I became to recognize that there's kind of a pattern to the John Bennett Shaw letter. The first paragraph is introductory and an excuse for why it is he hasn't written.
Yeah.
And it's inevitably, you know, the people he's visited or the places he's been, or perhaps an illness, or more likely it's just there's so much correspondence here I can't keep up. And the second paragraph is kind of what he really wants to get to, whatever it is he's talking to you, either he's looking for you to do something or wants to commend you on something that you've done or something. And then the third is either a bad joke, because Shaw loved bad puns, and oh my gosh, you know, sometimes his humor was, oh, you can't let the children see this kind of stuff, but something that would leave you with a smile or a laugh, and that was John, you know. And the other thing that we need to say here, if we're going to talk about John had sharp opinions, and he was not afraid to express them. You know, he had sharp opinions about this person or that person or things that were going on in the world. He especially, you know, he was a Democrat. He did not like a lot of Republicans, and he you know, would sometimes say cruel things about them in letters. And you know, but if he had heard a joke and if it was a little off color, he didn't care. He was going to write it and send it to 10 different people all around the world. But that you know, that was John. That was John. He but his correspondence, I think one of the reasons why we all love getting letters from John is because it was like sitting down and talking with him. I mean, the letter you saw on the page was John Shaw. That exactly was a distillation of what it would be like to sit down and have dinner with him.
Right.
So one of the reasons I put so many letters on the website, though, from you guys, you know, all three of you shared letters. And I felt that this is the Shaw that we're looking for here, you know. Not the guy dressed up at the podium, but the guy sitting at the typewriter with his dog at his feet and having a margarita, maybe, who knows, you know. But, yeah, the letters really give the spirit of John on the website.
Yeah, they do.
I talking about his opinions, and kind of a joke and an opinion, but more of an opinion, I think. When in the interview I did with him, that previously referenced interview, somehow it was like right when the Granada television series was going strong, and somehow that came up, and I go, well, what do you think of that show? Because, you know, there were some old line Sherlockians who didn't really care for it, and
right.
And he goes, oh well, if you're up to date and like Sherlock Holmes pretty much how he was, you like this TV show. If you're old and have piles, you like Basil Rathbone.
Yes.
I wouldn't like Shaw.
Well,
Is that?
yes, that's the man. That's the guy.
Yeah, it's great. So let's talk about his his library, because for a long time that library of his in Santa Fe, oh shoot, it's back there, I should get something. His library in Santa Fe was kind of legendary, and I know that people would pilgrimage out to see it. They would go to to see this room. Yeah, look at this. Yes, right.
Just from all over. This is the back of the Sage of Santa Fe.
So what's that? What is that event that we're looking at there? Is it
It's
cited?
just a bunch of guys from Denver or somewhere visiting. I don't mean to jump on what you were saying, but I just want people to know that we have a 98-minute video on the website that was sent in by Steve Robinson from Denver. He and a couple other guys went down there and just filmed John. It's a little shaky here and there, you know, but you get a real spirit of what he's like. And a tour of the library goes through every shelf and all the books. And if you want to know what that library was like, you really need to watch that video.
Yeah.
You can see a link for that right down here, everybody. So go take
Okay.
a look at it. So Peter, you went there. You'd been there and saw it. You mentioned earlier that you'd seen it.
One visitor to his library, a young 14-year-old boy, was brought by his father to meet John Bennett Shaw and see the library. And the 14-year-old boy was Mitch Cullen.
Oh, yeah.
Went on to write a very good pastiche, and then discovered that his pastiche was turned into a film, which was Mr. Holmes, starring Ian McKellen.
Yeah.
And one of the grounds for the Conan Doyle Estate Limited lawsuit against the movie studio was that Mitch Cullen had visited John Bennett Shaw's library and read Conan Doyle's books there, and therefore was infringing on their rights. and Mitch
That is
Cullen
lame.
to this day will not talk about that.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
Wow.
oh, wow.
Gentlemen, let's take a momentary break. It is time to hear, once again, from our sponsor. And with that, we're back.
You know, it wasn't just Sherlockians that came there. He was very hospitable. And his wife, Dorothy, was very nice and made lunch and catered for everybody. And
She was quite a nice woman. I met her at
The long,
somewhere.
the long-suffering Dorothy Rose Shaw. You know, wow. When you think about what she had to put up with, you know, I mean, just people marching through her house unceasingly. Yeah.
People would just show up. I remember him telling me that one time too. Oh yeah, I'll be sitting there in my underwear and someone will knock at the door. I remember
he came to Washington one time to a meeting at the Red Circle at the National Press Club. And I stood up and explained to everybody at the meeting that I was going to introduce our guest of honor, someone who had had a wonderful home and welcomed Sherlockians to it day after day after day. And it was just a wonder to the Sherlockian world. And as I went on with this introduction, John Bennett Shaw started to get up out because John needed a little time to get out of his chair. John was just about out of his chair. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, Dorothy Rose Shaw.
Wow.
Do about this.
Good move.
good one.
Oh my.
That is so great.
And the only person who would love that more than Peter perhaps was John. You know, I mean, later on he would probably tell that story 10 times on himself, and it would get better with each telling. I remember going to Stevens and of course Williamsburg, but maybe we'll get to that in a few minutes. Yeah, Berry College down in Georgia, where John discovered that they were in a dry county and there was no alcohol. That was an interesting one. And then Minneapolis in 1984, which was huge and a huge lot of fun. And John by that point had decided that his collection was going to go to Minneapolis, and it was he was, for as much as he enjoyed his collection, I think, especially as his various illnesses started to come on, he came to recognize that there was a necessity for him to be really thinking about what happens next to his collection, and what would be the best way of making sure that it was available to others. One of the first times I saw Peter Blau and John Shaw together was at I think it was at, I can't remember what conference it was, but they were talking about their collecting, and I asked them what they were planning on doing with it. And John, even in those days, was already talking about putting it to a library. And Peter, I don't know if you still have the same point of view, but in those days you felt that you had gotten all of these things because somebody decided to sell them, and you were thinking about letting them go back out into the wild again so that others could get them. I don't know if that's still what you're thinking.
That's still my plan. Sell the sucker,
Yeah.
I'll tell you about John Bennett Shaw's first Sherlockian conference, which wasn't his. It was exactly 50 years ago, in 1971. The people in Toronto decided to launch the Arthur Conan Doyle collection.
Yeah.
And they invited John Bennett Shaw to come to Toronto to be part of this. And he said yes. And he told me and Francine Morris that they'd better come. Francine was a librarian, so she understood this, and I like to travel. So we went up to Toronto for this conference, which was Toronto Public Library wanted to make a splash. So they'd invited a lot of professors and curators, and the whole first day of this conference was professors and curators talking about libraries. And the second day was John Bennett Shaw talking about the world of Sherlock Holmes, greatly bewildering all of these professors. But that was John.
Well, I noticed that in the wake of that, we never really had a day at any of these conferences where it was a whole day of professors and librarians talking about that sort of thing. It was always about Sherlock Holmes, so he must have remembered.
Yeah.
To Minneapolis, where they decided that Minneapolis wanted to make sure the administration, the powers that be at the university, knew that this collection was something more than just a weird corner of the library. So they spent the first day, they had people coming in talking about things they had researched in the Afghan war and all of this stuff. And Sherlockians didn't understand what was going on. Well, the second day was Sherlockians, and the professors didn't understand what was going on. They've never done that again.
On the first day, some of us went out for drinks. Hey, so let me just quickly talk about Williamsburg, if I could, because there was a tiny Sherlock Holmes group called the Cremona Fiddlers of Williamsburg, but there really were about 5 of us. It was Chuck and Peggy Henry, God bless their memories, who lived up in Richmond, who were members of the group. Myself, John Lanzalotti, and Dave Morrill, who helped out. And we didn't know what we were doing. Peggy actually was a professional meeting planner, and she's the one who helped us kind of put together a budget, and we based it on the largest number of people who had come to a Shaw conference before that, which was 100. We had to close out registration at 200 because we simply couldn't fit people into the rooms that we had. It was 1987. It was the 100th anniversary of Study in Scarlet. There were international stories being written about that, and they were mentioning these conferences, and I was getting phone calls from all over the world, in those days, from people who wanted to come. It was overwhelming. It was wonderful. John was in his element. He was feeling he was feeling his age, but at the same time, I think being among that crowd kept him revived and gave him some energy and some spirit. Peter was there, and Byerly Marlowe was there. She played her flute, I remember. Just a bunch of people, and we had a program, and then John would say, "Oh, this person has something they want to do. Let's give them an opportunity to do 10 minutes on this." And so we did, and it was just loads and loads and loads of fun. And it was so much fun, in fact, that 4 years later we did another conference. John unfortunately could not come because his health precluded him from doing it. But I think people came to the second conference because they just had such a darn good time the first time around. But the money that we made from those two conferences kept the Cremona Fiddlers of Williamsburg well heeled for over a decade. It was great. It was really terrific.
That may be one of those few instances when these Sherlocking conferences actually are in the black.
Yeah, no, it really did. Yeah, you can speak from experience there, but it was John. John was the draw. There was no doubt about it. But it was just tremendous fun, and from that point on, we John and I, whenever we were together, we would hang out and talk a little bit about the good old days, down in Williamsburg. But it really solidified our friendship too. There were moments where we disagreed on things, when he had expectations that something would be done a particular kind of way, and I tried my best to do it, and sometimes it worked that way, and sometimes it didn't. But my biggest memory, it was horribly hot that weekend. Oh my gosh, it was just dastardly hot. The temperature reached 100 at one point. Michael Harrison was there. Michael wore a full wool suit with a vest and a hat, and he needed to be. He was going back to. We had put up people in one of the residence halls at the College of William and Mary, and I was afraid for Michael's health, and so I actually walked him to the residence hall. And as we were walking over, I said to him, Michael, no one would think any worse of you if you were to take off the vest. If you just want to just keep the jacket on. And he's puffing along. He's walking with me. He said, "Well, my boy, one does what one can for the ladies." But those were the sort of characters who just seemed to find their way around John and made hanging out with him and the folks around him so much fun.
There were some real characters back then too. I'm telling you.
Oh my Lord! Yeah.
Ray, if I can jump in here, that was my first and only John Shaw conference that I got to go to. I think there were 8 or 9 of us came from Nashville, and we had the head guys of the BSI was there. John was Simpson, and then Wiggins was there. Bob Tomlin, I guess, or Tom Sticks. And so they were all 3 there. And our president of our society, who's Gail Stahl, he photobombed this picture of the 3 BSI guys. So he's in that picture. But and it was published in the Tennessean. But when it came out for John's dedication of the library, they put a book together. And Shaw has been edited out of the picture. We've got the 3 BSI leaders there, but Gail Stahl is gone. We've always. It was a wonderful conference, though. I'll never forget it.
Yeah, it was tremendous fun. So we're all talking about John, but I came across something. I have this interest in Vincent Sterrett, and I came across something a number of years ago. And apparently Shaw came on Sterrett's radar in 1948. Wow. So Shaw was in Tulsa, and he was a bookseller. And this is a column from the May 9, 1948 Chicago Tribune. John Bennett Shaw, written by Sterrett. John Bennett Shaw, Tulsa bookseller and bibliophile, is the subject of a recent article by Martin Gardner of Chicago in the Tulsa Magazine that strikes me as very amusing. Now, we know Martin Gardner was a tremendous friend of John's. Peter, were they roommates back at Notre Dame? I think that's right. Yeah.
Roommates.
Yeah.
Played doubles together.
Ah, there you go. Okay, very good.
High school buddies.
There you go. According to Gardner, Shaw collects books, sells books, and lets the customers fall where they may. As a bookseller, Gardner says Shaw's sense of humor sometimes urges him to unorthodox practices. He once had in the shop a copy of a book by H.V. Kaltenborn, one of his pet aversions. Kaltenborn was a radio announcer on CBS, an analyst in those days. The book would not sell, so he cut the price in half, and then to a quarter of the publisher's figure, and finally marked it down to 10 cents. When it still remained unsold, he wrote on the inside cover, "I will give 5 cents to anybody who buys this book." A few days afterward, a well-dressed man approached with a despised volume in his hand. Whether he had seen the penciled note inside is still a mystery, for without a moment's of hesitation, Shaw snatched the book from him, wrapped it with scrupulous care, handed him a nickel from the cash register, and watched the stranger depart flabbergasted.
Oh, wow.
See, John Shaw was John Shaw even in 1948. I mean, that's just the kind of behavior you would expect from him.
So interesting, because so many people, I've learned that so many people who are sort of larger than life have had interesting lives, apart from the Sherlockian world and apart from, whatever narrow, I'm speaking personally now, whatever narrow point of contact and knowing them exists. And I mean, Shaw was a bookseller in his life, over the course of his life, a bookseller.
Right.
Help me here, Jim. He was an undertaker or a funeral director.
He ran a funeral home. He had the oil drilling company.
Oil drilling company, right?
Yeah, he did a little bit of everything.
John liked to brag. After the Shaw Drilling Company, he left that to do the funeral home. He liked to say that he spent his career dealing with holes in the ground. The pilgrimage to Holmes Peak, north of Tulsa. And you stand at the top of this peak. You realize that it's in the middle of an oil field. And you look around, and the last time I was there were still pump jacks working on these wells, producing 10 barrels a day or something like that. And I went and looked at the records, and half of those wells were drilled by the Shaw Drilling Company.
I'll be darned. I didn't know
Of course,
that.
his library is in a hole in the ground in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
It's underground. So
That's
he never
true.
could get away from holes.
Well, guys, we're almost out of time, so I just want to kind of think a little philosophically for a moment. I think about the culture of our community and the world the community we live in, and the way we celebrate this hobby. When I think of like the daily Sherlockian life or the kind of the regional and local Sherlockian life, apart from the science societies, well, even with the science societies, to me, it's like so many of these local clubs, those seeds were planted by Shaw, inspired by Shaw, the ones that have gone the distance, and even newer ones, maybe they don't even understand that the model they're running on is one that was kind of built by him, inspired by him. And then, when you go to weekend events, I know, as it was said, many of them are kind of following a framework that was established. How much do we owe John Bennett Shaw for the community that we enjoy so much?
Well, I'll tell you one thing you owe John Bennett Shaw. If any of you actually read my monthly newsletter, that started as sheets of paper I kept on my typewriter. And when a sheet or two got full of gossip, who's done what, who's offering this, I would just put them in an envelope and send it to John. John would do the same before the internet. This is how we exchange information about what was going on in the world. So these information sheets started in the very early 1970s, and now they're scuttlebutt from the spermaceti press. So if you in any way appreciate or benefit from scuttlebutt, thanks to John.
See, that's a great.
Yeah, and Steve, we've talked about a couple of John's characteristics: his great sense of humor, his willingness to give away duplicates, and his desire to walk around the room. If he saw a face he didn't recognize, go up, introduce himself, and bring that person into the conversation, introduce that person to others who were there. I learned all those things from John. And if I do any of them today, that's the reason why. So he personally had that kind of impact on me. He was a very gregarious kind of guy. I am not actually gregarious by nature, but when I get into that kind of world and I see someone sitting in the corner, I go over and sit down and talk, and we have a conversation, and John's the reason why. There are all kinds of personalities involved in the Sherlock Holmes movement. Not everyone's really comfortable in a big, large room, but sometimes you just need to sit down and chat with someone one-on-one. The one thing that I will say, I tried to collect everything. Without John's money, without John's resources, without John's knowledge, without John's experience, it was a disaster. One of the reasons why I specialized in Vincent Sterrett is because I just couldn't collect everything, and so it just seemed to me it would be a better idea to collect one kind of thing, and that's one of the reasons why I did it. So yeah, in addition to kind of this kind of global influence that he had on me personally, it's been huge.
Let me jump in here and say that you three gentlemen helped me with the Shaw site so much. It's not something I did, it's something I collected from your letters, from your experiences. You'll see from the website, here are two young guys, Stephen, you and Ray, you, who were influenced by Shaw, and it changed your lives. I mean, it really did. And then we have benefited from all that. And Peter Blau has picked up on that. He's, from that golden era, as I heard someone say, John and Peter from that golden era, and Vincent Sterrett just before them. But his influence is rolling through the Gillette to Brett, and all the things that you put on the Sterrett studies in Sterrett. I owe you a lot, but I think Sherlockians in general owe you a lot. I thank you for that.
Well, it rolls past me. Personally speaking, maybe this would be a good way to end the show today. Personally speaking, that moment, I had a couple moments. I had one when I joined the South Bend Science Society. I was 14, and they could have said no, but they didn't. And then again, okay, so I'm there, and I go to this conference, and like I said, it's a mixed memory. More fondly now because I'm not 16 anymore, and I can remember, so I can kind of look back on it through a different lens. But if he had ignored me or had patronized me or made me feel weird or somehow less, I can tell you everything I did after that either wouldn't have happened or would have happened differently. And so I owe him tremendously. I mean, it is a tremendous debt in that regard that I owe him. And so that's why I want people to know, to remember him, learn about him, because he really mattered. He really did. And so anyway, guys, we are out of time. So I want to thank you all. This has been a real treat for me. Very great treat for me. So I want to thank you all for coming on here today and just remembering John and what he all meant to us and sharing some stories.
Thank you for putting this all together. It's
Yeah.
really, really good.
Spending time remembering John is always worthwhile. Thanks.
Always worthwhile. And if you have, and for you viewers, if you really want to learn more about John, go to Jim's website. The URL is here. Go to his website. Go to the Facebook page, and if you are also, if you know John, knew John, had memories, share them with Jim. He's collecting them for the benefit of all of us here. So, really grateful. All right, gentlemen, we must call it a day. So, take care, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Wow, what a trip down memory lane. That was so wonderful. For those of you who knew John Bennett Shaw, I'm sure you'll be able to relate. And for those of you who, for who he may be a new person to think about, I hope you enjoyed that as well. I want to thank every single person who watches the show and gives us such positive feedback and encourages us to keep going. We are so grateful here, so grateful. I'm a broken record, I know. But we're long, so I'm going to have to draw it to a close. We'll be back next time with another terrific show you will not want to miss. And until then, take care, and I look forward to seeing you.